Would you rather have a short life full of deep, meaningful experiences, or a longer life with less intense pleasures, but a higher quantity of pleasure overall? Bentham and Mill clashed on this issue, but who was right? In this video, we'll break down Bentham's Quantitative Utilitarianism and Mill's Qualitative Utilitarianism. Hedonism is the position that says that the only thing of value and disvalue is pleasure and pain. Utilitarianism, as conceived by Bentham, takes hedonism as its foundation and theory of value. Hedonistic utilitarianism, therefore, says that we ought to act so as to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Since pleasure is an experience, we can think of it as having measurable aspects, namely an intensity and duration. The more intense and long-lasting the pleasure, the greater its overall quantity. And this isn't about judging actions like in Bentham's hedonic calculus, which features additional factors, but about how we experience pleasure itself. When you eat an ice cream, say, you could rank the intensity of the pleasure out of 10 and add 1 point for each minute that it lasts. In theory, you could do this for every pleasure you experience. In other words, all pleasure is commensurable. That is, they can be measured on the same scale. You ought to prefer the pleasures, says Bentham, that score more highly. And since we all enjoy different pleasures, do whatever is most pleasurable for you. As Bentham is frequently paraphrased as saying, quantity of pleasure being equal, pushpin is as good as poetry. If you get just as much pleasure from scrolling TikTok all day as I do from strolling in nature on a sunny day while contemplating universal truths after studying Plato's Republic, that's okay. It doesn't matter what you enjoy, only how much you enjoy it. Or does it? What could possibly go wrong with this conception of pleasure? Imagine before birth you're offered the choice of living your earthly life as the famous composer Joseph Haydn or as an immortal Oyster. As Haydn, your life sounds amazing, as does the music that you will compose. You'll be highly successful, be honoured, compose beautiful music that will be celebrated and appreciated centuries after your death. You have the opportunity to experience the best life can offer. The oyster's life, not so much. You experience only mild pleasures, akin to a happily drunk person floating in a warm bath, but nothing more. Which life do you choose? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Of course, you'd pick Haydn's rich, fulfilling life over a mindless oyster's existence, right? But if Bentham is correct, you'd be making a very severe mistake. Why? Because although the oyster's pleasures are unvaried and small, given enough time, those pleasures will stack up and eclipse those of Haydn's finite 77 years. And that's the problem. If Bentham's right and pleasure's fully commensurable, we should prefer the oyster's life. But something about that seems wrong, so how do we solve this conundrum? Mill's solution is to say that pleasure is not simply a measure of intensity and duration, but also quality. There are different kinds of pleasures, and these pleasures differ in quality. There's a different feel, say, to eating an ice cream, and the pleasure of accomplishing some achievement. A key criticism in Mill's time is that utilitarianism is a pig philosophy, a label so amicably placed upon it by Thomas Carlyle. Their point being that utilitarianism gives us no higher goal than what is achievable by swine. But what Mill points out is that human beings possess faculties far more elevated than that of pigs, and certainly oysters, which opens the door to experiencing pleasures of a much higher quality. What sort of pleasures are these? Well, says Mill, they are the pleasures of the intellect, of the feelings and imagination, and of moral sentiments. The idea is that some pleasures are simply better than others. Higher pleasures, like engaging with philosophy, poetry, or music, stimulate the intellect and emotions. Lower pleasures, like eating and drinking, are just about raw sensation. The quality of some pleasures might be so high, he says, that we ought to prefer them even to a greater quantity of lower quality pleasure. The result is that Mill abolishes the commensurability scale of Bentham. While you can measure and compare pleasures when the only difference between them is a matter of quantity, you can't do this when there is a difference in quality. This is because the pleasure is more worthwhile simply because of the kind of pleasure that it is, regardless of quantity. And so the oyster's life will not outweigh the pleasure of Haydn's. Haydn's pleasures are in a different league. The higher pleasures of a human are simply not comparable with the lowly pleasures of an oyster. But if higher pleasures are such that we ought to prefer them to lower pleasures even of a greater quantity, does that mean I ought to always prefer poetry to greatly pleasurable bodily sensations. You know, if the choice is between, say, sex and reading John Milton, should I always choose Milton? Well, no. To hold Mill to this is probably a misinterpretation of his theory. The key passage that is often misunderstood appears to tell us that if someone has experienced two pleasures, one of which they judge so highly that they will not resign it for any quantity of the other pleasure which their nature is capable of, we are justified in ascribing to the preferred enjoyment a superiority in quality, so far outweighing quantity as to render it in comparison of small account. What Mill is really saying is that of the two kinds of pleasure that our nature is capable of, we would not give up a life capable of intellectual pleasures for a life of solely sensual pleasures, even if we could achieve a greater quantity. If you experience the pleasures attainable by the Oyster and then you experience those attainable by Haydn, you would not give up the opportunity to be Haydn, even though knowing that in the long run the Oyster experiences more pleasures. In fact, Mill stipulates that the best life is one as rich as possible in enjoyments, both in point of quantity and quality. And while there are many pleasures like eating and drinking that seem to be lower pleasures, there are often second-order pleasures that can boost an otherwise lower pleasure into a higher one. What do I mean by that? Well, both humans and pigs can enjoy food, but humans eating is often accompanied by second-order pleasures of, say, the satisfaction of cooking a good meal, or the appreciation of the variety of flavours that we can have access to, or the enjoyment of the conversation that the meal fuels. These second-order pleasures cannot be enjoyed by pigs. So, what do you think? Does Mill's theory solve the problems that afflict Benthams? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you next time.